on the sovereignty of the people. Our present Constitution formally recognizes the principle of the sovereignty of the people, that is, the supremacy of the general will over any particular will. Indeed, this principle cannot be contested. In our days, many have attempted to obscure it, the evils which were caused and the crimes which were committed under the pretext of enforcing the general will lend apparent strength to the reasoning of those who would like to assign a different source to the authority of governments. Nevertheless, those arguments cannot stand against the simple definition of the words which they use. The law must be either the expression of the will of all, or that of the will of some. What would be the origin of exclusive privilege if you should grant it to that small number? If it is power, then power belongs to whoever takes it. It does not constitute a right, and if you acknowledge it as legitimate, it will be equally legitimate for whoever seizes it, and everyone will want to conquer it in his turn. If you suppose that the power of a small number is sanctioned by the assent of all, then that power becomes the general will. This principle applies to all institutions. Theocracy, royalty, aristocracy, whenever they rule men's minds, are simply the general will. When, on the other hand, they fail to rule them, they are nothing but force. In short, there are only two sorts of power in the world. One, illegitimate, which is force. The other, legitimate, which is the general will. But while we recognize the rights of that will, that is, the sovereignty of the people, it is necessary, indeed imperative, to understand its exact nature and to determine its precise extent. Without a precise and exact definition, the triumph of the theory could become a calamity in its application. The abstract recognition of the sovereignty of the people does not in the least increase the amount of liberty given to individuals. If we attribute to that sovereignty an amplitude which it must not have, liberty may be lost notwithstanding that principle, or even through it. The precaution which we recommend, and which we shall take ourselves, is the most indispensable, in so far as men of party, no matter how pure their intentions, are always reluctant to limit sovereignty. They regard themselves as its presumptive heirs, and they administer their future property even when it is in the hands of their enemies. They mistrust such and such a kind of government, such and such a class of rulers, but let them organize authority in their own way, let them commit it to delegates of their choosing, and they will come to believe there is no limit to it. When you establish that the sovereignty of the people is unlimited, you create and toss at random into human society a degree of power which is too large in itself, and which is bound to constitute an evil, in whatever hands it is placed. Entrust it to one man, to several, to all, you will still find that it is equally an evil. You will think that it is the fault of the holders of such power and, according to the circumstances, you will accuse in turn monarchy, aristocracy, democracy, mixed governments, or the representative system. You will be wrong. It is in fact the degree of force, not its holders, which must be denounced. It is against the weapon, not against the arm holding it, that it is necessary to strike ruthlessly. There are weights too heavy for the hand of man. The error of those who, in good faith, in their love of liberty, have granted boundless power to the sovereignty of the people, derives from the way in which their political ideas were formed. In history, they have observed a small number of men, or even a single individual, in possession of an immense power which caused much harm. But their wrath has been directed against the holders of the power rather than against the power itself. Instead of destroying it, they have simply thought of replacing it. It was a curse, yet they have regarded it as a conquest. They have bestowed it upon the entire society. It has necessarily passed from society at large to the majority, from the majority to the hands of a few men, often to a single man. It has caused as much evil as before, while the examples, the objections, the arguments, and the evidence have multiplied themselves against all political institutions. In a society founded upon the sovereignty of the people, it is certain that no individual, no class, are entitled to subject the rest to their particular will. But it is not true that society as a whole has unlimited authority over its members. The universality of the citizens is sovereign in the sense that no individual, no faction, no partial association can arrogate sovereignty to itself unless it has been delegated to it. But it does not follow from this that the universality of the citizens, or those who are invested with the sovereignty by them, can dispose sovereignly of the existence of individuals. There is, on the contrary, a part of human existence which by necessity remains individual and independent, and which is, by right, outside any social competence. Sovereignty has only a limited and relative existence. At the point where independence and individual existence begin, the jurisdiction of sovereignty ends. If society oversteps this line, it is as guilty as the despot who has as his only title his exterminating sword. Society cannot exceed its competence without usurpation, nor bypass the majority without being factious. The assent of the majority is not enough, in any case, to legitimate its acts. There are acts that nothing could possibly sanction. Whenever some authority commits any such acts, it hardly matters from which source it emanates. It is irrelevant whether it calls itself an individual or a nation. Were it the whole of the nation, save the citizen whom it oppresses, it would be none the more legitimate. Rousseau overlooked this truth, and his error made of his social contract, so often invoked in favor of liberty, the most formidable support for all kinds of despotism. He defined the contract struck between society and its members as the complete alienation of each individual, with all his rights, without any reservations, to the community. In order to reassure us about the consequences of such an absolute renunciation of all the parts of our existence for the benefit of an abstract being, he tells us that the sovereign, that is, the social body, can neither harm the totality of its members, nor any of them in particular. Since everyone gives himself entirely, all share the same condition, and nobody is interested in making that condition onerous to the others. Because every individual gives himself to all, he does not give himself to anyone in particular. Everybody acquires over his associates the same rights as he surrenders in their favor. Thus he gains the equivalent of all that he loses, together with greater strength to preserve what he has. However, Rousseau forgets that all those preserving attributes which he confers on the abstract being he calls the sovereign derive from the fact that it is formed by all individuals without exception. But as soon as the sovereign must make use of the power which he possesses, in other words, as soon as it is necessary to proceed to the practical organization of authority, as the sovereign cannot exercise it himself, he must delegate it, and all those attributes disappear. Because the action performed in the name of all is necessarily, whether we like it or not, at the disposal of a single individual or of a few, it happens that, in giving oneself to all, one does not give oneself to nobody. On the contrary, one submits oneself to those who act in the name of all. Hence it follows that, by giving ourselves entirely, we do not enter a condition equal for all, because some derive exclusive advantage from the sacrifice of the rest. It is not true that nobody has an interest in making the condition of the others more onerous, because there are associates who are above the common condition. It is not true that all associates gain the same rights as those they renounce. Not all of them gain the equivalent of what they lose, and the result of what they sacrifice is, or can be, the establishment of a power which takes away from them whatever they have. Rousseau himself was appalled by these consequences. Horror-struck at the immense social power which he had thus created, he did not know into whose hands to commit such monstrous force, and he could find no other protection against the danger inseparable from such sovereignty than an expedient which made its exercise impossible. He declared that sovereignty could not be alienated, delegated, or represented. This was equivalent to declaring, in other words, that it could not be exercised. It meant, in practice, destroying the principle which he had just proclaimed. Observe instead how much franker the partisans of despotism are in their course when they set out from the same axiom, since it is an axiom which supports and favors them. Hobbes, the man who has most intelligently reduced despotism to a system, hastened to acknowledge sovereignty as unlimited, in order to infer from this the legitimacy of the absolute government of a single individual. Sovereignty, he says, is absolute. This truth has been recognized in all times, even by those who have excited sedition or provoked civil wars. Their aim was not to annihilate sovereignty, but rather to transfer its exercise elsewhere. Democracy is absolute sovereignty in the hands of all. Aristocracy, absolute sovereignty in the hands of some. Monarchy, absolute sovereignty in the hands of one man. The people have relinquished that absolute sovereignty in favor of a monarch, who has become its absolute possessor. It is clear that the absolute character which Hobbes attributes to the sovereignty of the people is the basis of his entire system. The word absolute distorts the whole question and leads us into a series of fresh implications. It is the point where the writer abandons the path of truth to proceed by sophism towards the aim which he proposed to himself when he set out. He proves that, since the conventions established by men are not sufficient to ensure that they will be observed, a coercive power is necessary to force men to observe them. Because society must protect itself from external aggression, it needs a common force armed for common defense. Because men are divided by their pretensions, they need laws to regulate their rights. He concludes from the first point that the sovereign has the absolute right to punish, from the second, that he has the absolute right to make war, from the third, that he is the absolute legislator. Nothing could be more false than these conclusions. The sovereign has indeed the right to punish, but only in the case of guilty actions. He has the right to make war, but only when society is attacked. He has the right to make laws, but only when these laws are necessary and when they are in accord with justice. Consequently, nothing is absolute or arbitrary in these attributions. Nothing could be more false than these conclusions. The sovereign has indeed the right to punish, but only in the case of guilty actions. He has the right to make war, but only when society is attacked. He has the right to make laws, but only when these laws are necessary and when they are in accord with justice. Consequently, nothing is absolute or arbitrary in these attributions. Democracy is indeed authority entrusted to the hands of all, but it is only the measure of authority necessary for the safety of the association. Aristocracy is the same authority entrusted to a few. Monarchy, the same authority conferred on a single person. The people can renounce that authority in favor of a single individual or of a few. But their power is still as limited as that of the people who have invested them with it. By the suppression of a single word, gratuitously introduced into the construction of a sentence, Hobbes' whole dreadful system collapses. On the contrary, with the word absolute, neither liberty nor, as we shall see below, peace nor happiness are possible under any institutions. Popular government is simply a violent tyranny, monarchical government only a more concentrated despotism. When sovereignty is unlimited, there is no means of sheltering individuals from governments. It is in vain that you pretend to submit governments to the general will. It is always they who dictate the content of this will, and all your precautions become illusory. The people, Rousseau says, are sovereign in one respect and subject in another. But in practice, these two relations are always confused. It is easy for the authority to oppress the people as subject, in order to force it to express, as sovereign, the will which the authority prescribes for it. No political organization can escape from this danger. You may divide powers as much as you like. If the total of those powers is unlimited, those divided powers need only form a coalition, and there will be no remedy for despotism. What matters to us is not that our rights should not be violated by one power without the approval of another, but rather that any violation should be equally forbidden to all powers alike. It is not sufficient that the agents of the executive should have to appeal to the authority of the legislator. The legislator must be unable to authorize their action outside their legitimate sphere. It is of little account that the executive power should have no right to act without the support of the law, unless there are limits to that support, unless it is established that there are objects on which the legislator has no right to make a law, or, in other words, that sovereignty is limited, and that there are wills which neither the people nor its delegates have the right to have. This is what we must declare. This is the important truth, the eternal principle which we must establish. No authority upon earth is unlimited, neither that of the people, nor that of the men who declare themselves their representatives, nor that of the kings by whatever title they reign, nor, finally, that of the law, which, being merely the expression of the will of the people or of the prince, according to the form of government, must be circumscribed within the same limits as the authority from which it emanates. The citizens possess individual rights independently of all social and political authority, and any authority which violates these rights becomes illegitimate. The rights of the citizens are individual freedom, religious freedom, freedom of opinion, which includes the freedom to express oneself openly, the enjoyment of property, and a guarantee against all arbitrary power. And no authority can call these rights into question without destroying its own credentials. The sovereignty of the people is not unlimited, and since its will is not sufficient to legitimate whatever it happens to wish, the authority of the law, which is nothing but the true or supposed expression of that will, is not unlimited either. We must be prepared to make many sacrifices for public peace. We would be guilty in the eyes of morality if, out of a too inflexible attachment to our duties, we should resist all those laws which seem to encroach upon them. But no duty binds us to those pretended laws whose corrupting influence threatens the most noble parts of our existence, to those laws which not only restrain our legitimate liberties, but demand from us actions contrary to those eternal principles of justice and mercy that man cannot cease to observe without debasing and betraying his nature. As long as the law, be it good or bad, does not tend to deprave us, as long as the encroachments of authority exact from us sacrifices which do not make us either cowardly or ferocious, we may subscribe to them. We make a compromise only with ourselves. But if the law should order us to trample underfoot either our affections or our duties, if, on the pretext of a gigantic and factitious devotion for what would be called in turn now monarchy, now republic, the law should prevent us from being faithful to our unfortunate friends, if it prescribed treachery towards our allies, or even the persecution of our vanquished enemies, let a curse fall upon the list of injustices and crimes thus covered by the name of the law. A positive, general, unrestricted duty, every time a law seems unjust, is to avoid becoming its executor. This passive resistance does not carry with it any upheavals, revolutions, or disorders. Nothing justifies the man who lends his assistance to a law which he believes iniquitous. Terror is by no means a more valid excuse than any other infamous passion. Woe betide those zealous and docile instruments, eternally oppressed, according to them, indefatigable agents of all existing tyrannies, posthumous accusers of all tyrannies that have been overthrown. In one terrible era we were told that one became the agent of unjust laws in order to mitigate their rigor, that the power of which one agreed to become the depository would have caused even greater evil had it fallen into less pure hands. Deceitful transaction, which opened a limitless career to every sort of crime. Everyone bargained with his own conscience, and every degree of injustice found its worthy executors. I cannot see why, in such a system, one should not volunteer to become the executioner of the innocent, on the pretext that one would strangle him more gently. Let us now sum up the consequences of our principles. The sovereignty of the people is not unlimited. It is, on the contrary, circumscribed within the limits traced by justice and by the rights of individuals. The will of an entire people cannot make just what is unjust. The representatives of the nation have no right to do what the nation itself has no right to do. No monarch, whatever title he may claim, whether that title rests upon divine right, the right of conquest, or the assent of the people, possesses a power without limits. God, if he intervenes in human affairs, can only sanction justice. The right of conquest is simply force which is not a right, since it passes to whomever seizes it. The assent of the people cannot legitimate what is illegitimate, because the people cannot delegate to anyone authority which they do not themselves possess. An objection presents itself against the limitation of sovereignty. Is it really possible to limit it? Can any force effectively prevent it from crossing the barriers prescribed to it? It is possible, some will argue, through ingenious combinations, to restrain power by dividing it. We may set its different parts in opposition and balance them against one another. Yet by what means can we ensure that the total sum will not be unlimited? How is it possible to limit power other than through power itself? No doubt, the abstract limitation of sovereignty is not sufficient. We must find for political institutions foundations which combine the interest of the different holders of power so that their most apparent, most durable, and most certain advantage would be to remain within the limits of their respective attributions. Yet the first question is still that of the competence and limitation of sovereignty. Before we organize something, we must have determined its nature and extension. Second, without exaggerating, as philosophers have done only too often, the influence of truth, We may affirm that when certain principles are clearly and completely demonstrated, they tend to become their own guarantee. A universal opinion is formed on the basis of evidence, which is soon victorious. If it is recognized that there is on earth no unlimited power, no one, in any age, will dare to claim such a power. Experience has already proved this. We no longer attribute, for example, to society as a whole the right of life and death without judgment. Thus, no modern government claims to exercise any such right. If the tyrants of the ancient republics appear to us far more unrestrained than the governors of modern history, it is partly for this particular reason. The most monstrous acts of the despotism of a single individual were often based on the doctrine of the boundless power of all. Thus, the limitation of sovereignty is real, and it is also possible. It will be ensured firstly by the same force which legitimates all acknowledged truths, by public opinion. Subsequently, it will be guaranteed more precisely by the distribution and balance of powers. But you must begin by acknowledging this salutary limitation. Without this preliminary precaution, all is useless. In encompassing the sovereignty of the people within its just limits, you have nothing to fear. You take away from despotism, either by individuals or by assemblies, the apparent sanction it draws from the assent it commands, because you can prove that such assent, were it genuine, would still lack the power to sanction anything whatever. The people have no right to strike a single innocent, nor to treat as guilty a single accused, without legal evidence. Consequently, it cannot delegate such a right to anyone. The people have no right to violate the freedom of opinion, religious freedom, judicial safeguards, protective forms. Therefore, no despot, no assembly, can exercise such a right claiming that the people have invested them with it. Thus, all despotism is illegal. Nothing can sanction it, not even the popular will to which it appeals. It claims, in fact, in the name of the sovereignty of the people, a power which is no part of that sovereignty, and which is not only the illegal displacement of an existing power, but the creation of a power which should not exist in the first place.